We're almost ready now to dive into contemporary cognitive science. We traced the history of psychology a little bit, and we ended more or less at behaviorism and this great intellectual revolution that started after the Second World War. What did psychology do? Well, this birthed a new form of psychology, which coexists with lots of other forms of psychology, called cognitive psychology. And some of the hallmarks of this are it really aspires to being scientific in a manner which finds acceptance without unqualified recourse to introspection. Introspection never went away for the following reason. Nobody's going to buy a story about their own mind that contradicts everything they know about themselves. So although introspection is not a scientific method, it's always there as the baseline that any theory must meet. It must appear plausible to people who are themselves embodied beings with minds. Cognitive psychology does not deny the reality of mental states, including beliefs, desires, and intentions. Those are themselves key terms that underpin much of the assumptions of cognitive psychology. And most of the work done in cognitive psychology tries to avoid many of the philosophical issues we have encountered by working within a framework in which information processing plays a huge role. And we've seen that there's reason to be cautious here because the term information can be greatly misunderstood. Information, let's be very clear about this, information is not a free-floating natural kind out there in the environment to be picked up. It doesn't occur along with air and clouds and trees and information. That's not what's going on. The information processing paradigm provides a sort of a language, semi-technical, leaning to some extent on the mathematical notion of information, but frequently departing from it, in which the brain is thought of in terms of hardware and questions of mind and thinking are conceived of as if their relation to the brain was one of software to hardware. And with that, many metaphors, many ways of describing shadowy processes become available. Now, a computer has clearly defined inputs and outputs. Most work in the information processing paradigm leans on the assumption that one can separate inputs, which have to do something with perceiving a world, from outputs, which is one's actions or behaviors in the world. This together, these suite of four assumptions make up more or less the computational theory of mind. When you're reading popular articles and popular discussion, it's commonly assumed that this is the scientific theory of mind. This is not the scientific theory of mind. There is no the scientific theory of mind. This view currently coexists with very many alternatives, and cognitive science is very, very young. The term itself wasn't coined until 1973. There's been lots of developments, and we find ourselves in the middle of one of the most interesting events in the history of human ideas. Here are some of things that have happened in the meantime and which we'll be encountering as we go along. The kind of artificial intelligence modeling we saw in the last video, solving little childish problems, all intellectual, rule-based symbol manipulation, has become known as GOFI, good old-fashioned artificial intelligence, and it doesn't scale up to deal with interesting real-world problems. This is a problem which has become known as the frame problem. We'll meet it again. It used to be thought that if you just had enough facts written down and you could draw on them and you could provide that to a computer program, that it might be able to display intelligent behavior. That's true only for toy worlds. It works when you're playing Super Mario. It doesn't work when you're walking across a park. Many of the problems that people set out to address using concepts from the computational metaphor, from linguistics, and so on, have since been solved without much theory in an entirely different way. For example, the goal of the automatic translation of natural languages, that was one of the holy grails back in the 60s and 70s, and led to enormous amounts of funding in the belief that these new paradigms could finally crack an outstanding problem. That was not solved by these disciplines and has been solved by massive data-driven approaches by the likes of Google, who have access to data sets that are incomparably larger to anything that was available before, with generic machine learning algorithms that have nothing to do with human cognition. And so we can engineer solutions to many of these problems, but we learn absolutely nothing about human cognition as a result. There's never been a single language of the computational theory of mind, in many ways because computational ideas can be expressed in many dialects, using different computer languages, even using different configurations of hardware and software. But that whole language of information processing and computation is now living together with a different kind of formal language, which is finding application more and more in cognitive science. And this is dynamical systems theory, the use of differential equations, the calculus, which, let's face it, has been the principal engine of scientific progress since the birth of scientific modernity. It was Newton, together with Leibniz, or simultaneously with Leibniz, who invented the calculus, who gave us a way to capture mathematically a description of change. This, therefore, became the way scientific theories were expressed in all fields, and increasingly now also in cognitive science. It represents a different set of tools that encourage you to think in different ways. They're very, very good tools for describing most natural systems. We couldn't do weather forecasting without differential equations. We couldn't do economics. I don't know if that's a science. We couldn't do that without differential equations. We couldn't do any modern physics without differential equations. It remains to be seen whether we can sensibly apply such tools to the traditional questions which have loomed in cognitive science. Another thing that has drastically changed things is there's been huge advances in our ability to record various aspects of the brain. This is often referred to as brain imaging, although the term imaging is a little misleading. What it means is there's various kinds of measurements we can make of brains under various circumstances. And the technology has advanced hugely. So we don't have to guess so much at the physiological markers of brain activity. It is brains, though, that neuroscience investigates directly. It's not minds. For that, there's a separate discipline called cognitive neuroscience, which interprets brains using the concepts of whatever psychological or cognitive theory it chooses. So we've got lots to work with. Making sense of it is not that easy. We'll look at some neuroimaging techniques later on. Perhaps the most important development here has been a shift of that pendulum that swings between empirical and rationalist concerns, and will probably swing there forever. We mentioned that the computational turn represented a resurgence of rationalist intellectual conceptions of human cognition, which can be criticized for very, very many reasons, not least because they seem to make the ideal human someone who's been given a public education in a Western society. Increasingly, attention has been turned to the body, not the brain as if it were not part of the body. The brain is part of the body, so are the kidneys. The brain and the kidneys are both part of the body, and the body really can also be seen as the carrier, bearer, or subject of cognition. And there are many fields now which draw out this theme and get away from the idea of the brain as the producer of everything. Embodied cognitive science comes in many flavors. It's not just that the body is relevant, but there are really profound claims here about the manner in which we understand the body and the world. Embodied cognitive science isn't a single unified field, but there are many approaches to get away from the idea that your skillful mastery of the world and your awesome experience of the world should all be understood in terms of what's going on inside your head. So there is a crude distinction we can draw, and one we'll come back to many times throughout this. On the one side, on the left-hand side there, we have the representational cognitive science. This is cognitive science done using the computational theory of mind, using the technical terms of computation and information, which clearly distinguishes between the mental and the physical, is very neurocentric in that it associates words to do with minds with things to do with the brain inside the head. And its model, as it were, of how one interacts with the world is one as if one were distinct from the world. So if you go up to a vending machine, you push a button and the vending machine gives you something. In that case, there was a sequence, you addressed the machine and then the machine gave you something. That's much like the model of interaction here. And we saw this even in the stimulus response problems of behaviorism. Representational cognitive science tends to separate the subject, the knowing subject, from the known world. And its technical language is computation. Embodied cognitive science is a broader array of areas that have yet to fuse into a single field. But the activity of the body in the world, and not merely the activity of neural cells inside the skull, is seen as the thing to pay attention to understand how we make sense of the world and experience the world. Here, the model that underlies this of one's interaction with the world is a bit different from representational approaches. If representational approaches separate the subject from the world so that the subject addresses the world, does something, and then the world responds, in embodied cognitive science, that relationship is more like a handshake or a dance. That is, the body and the world are constantly in reciprocal contact with each other. You can't decompose a handshake into the activity of one hand and the activity of the other hand. There are many terms going around for schools within embodied cognitive science. One popular term is 4E schools, where the E's stand for embodied, as I've just pointed out. Enactive, which means we pay attention to how we bring about our being in the world by doing things in the world. That's a bit mystical. I'll get back to that one later. Extended, so that we're not talking about anything restricted to the skull, but that mind extends out into the world. So this doesn't allow for a strong mental physical distinction. And embedded, which draws us back to the fact that anything you want to describe about a person always happens in a context, and the context is just as much part of what is going on as is anything the person is doing. And so we end up with a landscape of very many approaches today. Some of them have been drawn out here. I think it's rather nice. At the top left, you can see substance dualism, the red dot being res cogitans, somehow separate from the world, res extensa, and somehow interacting with it. The next one on the top line shows behaviorism, which cuts out the red stuff altogether, doesn't talk about the mental. Then there's identity theory, which is close to what Marvin Minsky is adopting in the article you will have read for this week, which is to see mind and brain as different ways of talking about the same thing. Mind is what brain does. Functionalism is the most popular view within cognitive psychology. This is a combination of identity theory with the modularity of mind hypothesis, in which it's assumed that the right vocabulary for talking about behavior and cognition describes it in its own terms, and not in neural terms, for example, but that there is somehow going to be a mapping between these two. Maybe not as close as in identity theory, but many of the same presuppositions are there. Just going briefly through the bottom line, eliminativism is the idea that, the crazy idea, that all our talk about minds is just bad scientific talk, and when we get better at speaking neuroscience, we won't have any need for that. Go figure. Just for completeness, the intentional stance is the suggestion by a philosopher called Daniel Dennett, which is not to do with how we think of minds in ourselves, but how we think of minds in others, and that we treat other people as if they have minds for very good reason, that this turns out to be a successful way of being in the world. So it's very much not an essentialist claim about what minds are, but rather a rhetorical move pointing out that in our interaction with each other, we treat each other as if we have minds of a particular kind. Then the extended mind gets rid of this view of everything being in the head and allows mental processes to be distributed in the world, and embodied cognition, in which the whole world is in a dance, and the whole body is in a dance with the world. That's very many to choose from, and there's many more. So what I'd like to do, I'd like to wrap up this first unit by going back to something pre-scientific. Before we had a science of chemistry, we had alchemy. Alchemy was a wonderful endeavor, probably still is. And there's many ways to talk about alchemy. Alchemists were pursuing a diverse range of questions, some of them spiritual, some of them philosophical, some of them materialist, some of them looking for things like eternal life or how to turn lead into gold. And they had wild and wacky ideas. Alchemy is wonderfully fun to engage with, and they tended to generate lots of symbols. And one might think that alchemy never got anywhere. Now, I don't want to dive into the weeds on alchemy here, but I want to point out that one thing alchemy did was it gave people a lot of experience with what later became experimentation. It gave them a lot of facility over materials. They developed skills in separating, distilling, sorting materials, and out of alchemy was born chemistry, which is a secure science. In many respects, cognitive science is understandably still at the stage of alchemy. There's a lot of people who don't necessarily all share the same goal. They're trying out a bewildering range of techniques, giving rise to all these areas of technical specialization, many of which mean nothing to outsiders. And it will spin off. Bits of this will become usable, will become standard science, and other bits will disappear. So I think we can learn a lot from alchemy, and I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it's important not to rush to assume we have solutions for what are the most important questions we have, which are questions about our own being in the world.